Hey everybody! Recently, the Apigee team has made some great changes to the provisioning experience for the pay-as-you-go model. The new wizard is now much simpler with less number of steps, and also it makes smart default choices for you to get started. Behind the scenes, there are also some changes. It is now using a new network architecture model called Private Service Connect to allow access to the Apigee runtime. In this video, I will walk you through the new streamlined provisioning process, and I will explain how this new network architecture works. My name is Miguel Mendoza, and I hope you're going to learn something today. So let's go ahead and get started. I am here in the Apigee documentation for the pay-as-you-go model. We're going to be following the instructions for provisioning Apigee using the Cloud Console. First, let's take a look at the prerequisites. So we need to have a Google Cloud billing account. I already have that. We're going to need a Google Cloud project. I'm going to be creating a new one for this. For software, we're going to need the Google Cloud SDK and curl. Since I'm going to be using the Cloud Shell, these two are already installed, so that's not an issue. Finally, for permissions, it's saying that I'm going to, as the person who is provisioning Apigee, needs certain permissions. So let's go ahead and take a look at those permissions. Let's take a look at this. What this page is saying is that there are several ways to go about permissions when installing Apigee. The first one is if you are already the project owner, you don't have to do anything. You already have all the necessary permissions to install Apigee. If you're not the project owner, somebody else can assign you these specific roles and you're going to have all the necessary permissions. Or if you want to go even further and use the principle of least privilege, you can have a role that has just these permissions and you will be good to install Apigee. And this only applies if you're not doing a setup that is using a shared VPC. If you're using a shared VPC, you're going to need additional permissions on the project where the shared VPC is hosted. Great. So now that we have looked at all the prerequisites and the necessary permissions, let's go back to the main documentation page. So in step number 2, we're going to have to select a project. Remember, I don't have a project yet, so we're going to be creating a new one. So let's go ahead and create a new project. I'm going to name this my new Apigee Page demo. Let's select the billing account and create the project. This is gonna take a minute or so, so we'll wait here and come back once it's done. So the project has been created. Let's go ahead and select it. Perfect, so we're in the new project. Now let's go back to the instructions. For the next step, it wants me to check that billing is enabled on the cloud project. For me, I already know it's the case because when I created the project, I selected a billing account that is already active. So we'll move to the next step, number 4. This is going to take us to the landing page for Apigee in the Cloud Console where we can launch the new provisioning wizard. So let's go ahead and do that. Make sure you are in the project that you want to use. Then click on Set up Apigee. And here we are, the new wizard. Here, we're just going to be following the 4 steps from the wizard, which match one-to-one with these 4 pages from the documentation. So let's head back to the Cloud Console and get started. All right, so let's do the first step. I'm going to click on Enable APIs. And while this is happening, I'm going to explain more or less what each of these are needed for. So first you have the Apigee API. This is the actual API for the Apigee system. Then Compute Engine API. This is needed to create the access routing when you get to step 4. Cloud Key Management. This is needed for creating key rings and keys that are used to encrypt the disks and database from Apigee. And finally, the Service Networking API. This is needed for also setting up this step number 2 for doing the peering connection between your project and the Service Networking host project. Cool, so it looks like it's all done. We should be able to move to the next step. Let's move to step number 2 for setting up networking. Here, there's a few sections that need to be completed before we can move on. So let's go ahead and click on Edit. First thing, we need to fill up the authorized network. Because this is a new project, I do not have any VPCs created, so I'm going to need to create a new one. Let's go over to the other tab where I have the Cloud Console open. Let's go to VPC Network. We'll create a new VPC network and we'll call it Apigee Net. And let's do a new subnet as well. It's going to be called Apigee Subnet. Let's pick the region. Let's say this is going to be in US West 1. Let's pick the range for this subnet. Private Google access on. This is all good. Select the firewall rules. And let's create the VPC. This should take a minute or so, so we'll wait here and come back when it's done. Great, so the new VPC has been created. Let's head over back to the wizard. Now let's refresh and we should see the new VPC. All right, so it's all good. Next, it's asking us to allocate peering ranges. Now let me explain what that means. Behind the scenes, there's going to be a peering connection made from the Apigee Net VPC to the service networking VPC that is used by the Apigee runtime. Now, in that peering connection, we're going to need to make available 2 IP ranges. One is a /22 and the other one is a /28. The /22 is going to be used by the Apigee runtime to set up a subnet for all the runtime components. And the /28 is going to be reserved for future use by Apigee support in case they need to spin up VMs to do some troubleshooting. Now, if I left this as automatic, the wizard is going to, behind the scenes, allocate these 2 ranges for me, no problems, but there's an issue. I do not have control over the actual IP ranges, which is not good when this project later might become part of a bigger network since we want to avoid IP range conflicts. So what you should do instead is that you should ask the network administrator for a /22 and a /28 range that is free to use for Apigee. And once you have that, then you can go on the Cloud Console and manually allocate those ranges and associate them with the peering connection, which is what I'm going to do. Let's go over to the Cloud Console. Let's select the VPC we created earlier. Select Private Service Connection, and we're going to allocate the ranges in here. First, let's do the runtime range. And I'm going to pick a /22. Remember, this is something you should consult with your network administrator to make sure that this range is not going to conflict with the rest of your network. Similarly, let's do the range for Apigee support. And we'll do a /28. Great, so now we have both ranges available. While we're here, we might as well create that peering connection between this VPC and the service networking VPC that is used by Apigee. For that, we'll click here on Private Connection to Services, create a connection, and we're going to select Google Cloud Platform, and we're going to select both of the ranges we allocated so that these 2 ranges are available through the peering connection. And you can see here, this is the connection name, which has service networking-googleapis.com. So this is all good. So we can go ahead and click on connect. And this is going to take a few minutes or so. So I'll wait here and come back once it's done. So the peering connection has been created and you can see both ranges are available through the peering connection. So we should be able to go back to the provisioning wizard. Here, what I'm going to do, I can just refresh the wizard and it will detect the changes have been made already. So if I come back and click on edit, you can see now that it says, hey, the private service connection has been successfully created, so we're all good. Next, we had to select the runtime IP range. Now, this might be a little bit confusing. Didn't we just allocate a /22 and a /28 and created a peering connection with those two ranges available through the peering connection? Yes, but what can happen is that the peering connection can have other ranges available as well. So the wizard does not necessarily know from all the ranges that you have there which ones it should use. Now in this case, I could leave it as automatic, and because there's only two available, a /22 and a /28, it will have no problems and select the ones that I want. But if you have more ranges available, it's good to be explicit and tell it which ones do you want to use. So let's go ahead and do that and use custom and be explicit about it. So first one is going to be the runtime, which is this one right here. So we'll paste it. And the next one is going to be the support range, the /28, and we'll paste that in here. And I think that's all we need to complete the setup networking step. So we'll go ahead and click on connect. Let's move on to the next step, which is configure hosting and encryption. In here, I don't actually have to do anything. The wizard has already selected defaults that just make sense for me. The runtime region is in US West 1. That's all good. The analytics data is going to be stored in the US West 1 region. That's good as well. And finally, the Apigee database and disks are going to be encrypted using a key that is managed by Google. This means that I don't have to worry about rotating the keys or anything like that. It's all Google managed. Now, all of this is configurable. So if you want to, for example, use your own encryption keys, you could go ahead and click on edit and modify that. I'm not going to do that as the defaults already make sense for me. So I'm just going to go ahead and move to the next step, which is configure access routing. In this step, the wizard is asking us to configure client access to the Apigee runtime components. From a networking point of view, you could think of clients as either within your network or outside your network. Clients that are within your network would access the Apigee runtime through an internal load balancer, whereas clients who are outside your network would access the Apigee runtime over the internet through a global load balancer. The wizard has given me defaults that are suited for the external client access. It will create a global load balancer within this project, and that global load balancer is going to access the Apigee runtime using Private Service Connect. Once again, these defaults are customizable. I can click on the edit button and change the behavior. For example, if I do not want the wizard to create a global load balancer, I can click here on no internet access. This means that the wizard will not do anything in this step. It will be up to me to either create a global load balancer manually or create an internal load balancer for internal clients to access the Apigee runtime. For my case, I do want internet access, so I will choose enable internet access. The wizard has also selected smart default values for configuring the load balancer. For example, it's going to be using a wildcard DNS service for the domain of the load balancer, and it's going to be using Google managed certificates. Technically, I shouldn't have to do anything. I can just cancel here and leave all these settings as is, and it will work perfectly. However, in my case, I do not want to use a wildcard domain for accessing the Apigee runtime. Instead, I want to use my own custom domain name that I have chosen ahead of time. This is probably also the case for you if you work at a large organization. So let's go ahead and customize it. In my case, I only want to change the domain name. I'll keep the subnet and the certificate as the defaults. So let's use the new domain name, and we should be good to go. Great, so now all the steps in the wizard have been completed, so we can just click on submit and let the wizard begin provisioning the Apigee org and the runtime instance. Let's do that. We have a progress bar that tells us what step is being done at the moment and also gives us an estimate of more or less how long it's going to take to complete the provisioning process. This is a conservative estimate, usually takes less than an hour. For now, I'll leave it here and we'll come back once it's done. Alright, so provisioning is complete. It has been around 30 minutes since I started the provisioning process, and for some reason it still says it's processing. I'm not sure why, it might be a bug, but I think I can just refresh the page and it will take us to the final set of steps. Cool, so yay, congratulations, your Apigee organization is ready, and here's the next set of recommended steps. Since we used a custom domain name, it's telling me to create a DNS A record pointing to this IP address. This is the IP address of the load balancer, so let's go ahead and do that. I actually have a cloud DNS zone for this domain in another project. So let's open the Cloud Console, then head over to that project. Then let's go to Cloud DNS and open up the DNS zone where we can add a new record set. Okay, let's fill in the details. So first we put in the domain name, and it's an A record with a default time to live of 5 minutes. And for the IP address, this is going to be the IP address of the load balancer, which we can get from the wizard. Let's copy that. We put it in, and let's create a record. Let's head over back to the wizard for the next step. Here, on step number 2, the wizard is allowing us to deploy a Hello World API proxy to the Apigee organization. This will be useful to do the initial test to make sure that the connectivity is working end-to-end. So let's go ahead and deploy the Hello World API. This may take around a minute or so. So we'll wait here and come back when it's done. Cool, so the Hello World proxy has been deployed, and the wizard is giving me 2 different commands that I can use to test connectivity to the Hello World proxy. The first command, you can use it if you have not set up a DNS record. In my case, I already have done that, so I will use the second command. But before I do that, there's one more thing I would like to check. Because I used a custom domain for the global load balancer, and I also use Google managed certificates, sometimes it may take between 10 to 15 minutes for the Google managed certificates to be fully provisioned. Fortunately, there's a way to check that by going to the global load balancer in the Cloud Console. So let's go over to the Cloud Console and make sure that we are in the correct project associated with the Apigee organization. Now let's go to load balancers. We can see that there's one load balancer. This was created by the provisioning wizard. And we can confirm that this is it by looking at the front end, which has this IP address, which matches the IP address that we used to create the DNS record. Next, we can click on the certificate. This is the Google managed certificate. And we can see that it's already active, so I think we should be ready to go. So let's go back to the provisioning wizard and grab the curl command, and we can run this from the Cloud Shell. So I'm going to open a Cloud Shell. Great, now let's paste it. Great, and we see the response, hello world. So looks like it's all working. Well folks, this is it. We have successfully provisioned Apigee X with the pay-as-you-go model. The only thing that remains now is to go to the Apigee UI and start creating API proxies. Once you're here, just make sure you are in the correct organization, and this is it. For example, you can see the API proxies, and here we see the Hello World proxy that was created by the provisioning wizard. We can also go to the admin menu and take a look at the runtime instance that was created by the provisioning wizard. It is running on the US West 1 region. It has an internal IP address which is reachable from the PPC network that I created at the beginning of the video. It also has a private service connect service attachment. The global load balancer that was created by the provisioning wizard does not make use of this IP address. Instead, it uses a private service connect network endpoint group that is tied to this service attachment. This is significantly different from previous versions of the provisioning wizard. In the past, the wizard used to create a managed instance group of virtual machines in your project. Those virtual machines were used as a network bridge for the global load balancer to be able to reach this IP address. That's not the case anymore, folks. The wizard does not create VMs anymore in your project. Instead, all you have is the global load balancer and the private service connect network endpoint group that is tied to this service attachment. Well, folks, this is it for the walkthrough. If you have additional questions, don't hesitate to reach to me or other Googlers in the Apigee community. I have included a link in the video description. And if you found the content of this video useful, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one.